So one of my reading goals this year is to read 12 classic sci-fi. I've read 9 so far. I know. It's only May. I'm doing a great job. Please, please clap. One of the books that was recommended to me over and over and over again was A Canticle for Liebowitz by Walter M. Miller Jr., and it was published in 1957, and it was great. This is a book review. So there was a nuclear war, and a group of survivors band together. They call themselves the Simpletons because they blame technology and science and engineering for, the nuclear holocaust that happened to them. So as a response to save future humans, they go around burning libraries and destroying technology and murdering anyone who, can read good. The Catholic Church decides that it is important for them to start collecting documents related to science and engineering and math and store them, hopefully to be used by future humans at a later date. And I think this is related to a thing that actually happened in the Middle Ages, where the Catholic Church collected and copied the works of the Greeks and the Romans during the Middle Ages. I'm not a historian though. There are real historical figures who were monks and also proponents of science and natural history, Roger Bacon comes to mind. So I think that idea is taken and put into future post-apocalypse America. So the book itself takes place 600 years after this event, and you have this monastery church, I don't know the Catholic words, who is trying to make their patron Liebowitz a saint, because he's one of those engineers who, right after the nuclear war, started storing things and keeping documents in hopes of delivering it to the future people. The idea of post-apocalypse science librarian is really interesting to me, and if that sounds interesting to you at all, I would stop watching this video and just read the book, because everything else will be spoilers. I would say that I highly recommend this book, but also I think this book made me angrier than any book I've ever read. So we've all agreed that from now on it's just spoilers. I'm just going to tell you what happens in the book. This is your last chance. Okay, so this book is obviously 3 short stories stapled together, and I don't know if it works. On their own, each story was really good, but as a whole, I'm not quite sure. But the first story takes place 600 years after the event. You have a little young monk named Francis who's 17, and he's doing these desert duties when a wanderer, just a strange naked man, points him in the direction of a bunker. At this point, the book does something I really, really enjoy. It's a trope of future fiction where the main character in the book in the future is referencing something in the past but doesn't understand it. So he finds a fallout shelter, and it says fallout shelter, and he talks about these fallout monsters and how people would hide from these monsters in the shelter. I just think it's really fun. I like that. This book is very funny. But anyway, he finds a fallout shelter, and it just happens to be the fallout shelter of Liebowitz, the patron of his abbey. I don't know church words. And they're trying to make Liebowitz a saint, so finding these documents could be evidence of his miracles, which would be amazing for that purpose. So he goes back. Francis is painted as kind of a lovable idiot, and he doesn't want to mess anything up, so he kind of just he's I found this, and then he silently goes back to work. One of the things he ends up doing is copying one of the documents found in Leibowitz's fallout shelter, which is described to the reader as a blueprint, and we're not sure of what, just an engineering schematic. Francis, of course, thinks this is of great import because, Liebowitz is a saint, and so he starts copying this document, just like in the olden days. He's just copying it, making exact replicas of it, and since he thinks it's so important, he just takes so much care and effort, and he makes really good lettering, and he gets golds, and he starts painting little flecks on this blueprint that he's copying, and he spends 12 years of his life on this. And in those 12 years, the Pope of Texarkana is trying to make Saint Leibowitz, and suddenly it happens. They're going to make him a saint. And so Francis, now 12 years older, is tasked with bringing the documents, the original documents, to the Pope to be stored in like New Rome. And his priest boss tells Francis to bring the beautiful copy with the gold and all the ornate design on it as like a gift for the Pope, in addition to the original documents. So he goes, and because it's like a post-apocalyptic future, he's got to travel by donkey. It takes weeks and weeks and weeks, and he gets interrupted and intercepted by like a gang of hooligan robber people, simpletons. And they see that he's a man of the cloth, and they see that he's carrying documents, and they hate this, so they beat him up, and they open it, and they find the gold, and they're like, oh shit, this is gold. Francis is like, there's not a lot of gold in there. It's not worth anything. I spent 12 years of my life on it. And the simpletons are like, you spent 12 years on this? You did this for 12 years? It's so funny because you and I, the reader, we know that he's not copying anything important. It's a stupid blueprint of some stupid random technology that's not important. It doesn't tell you, it's not a textbook, right? It's not going to teach you any science. And it's just so cutting and so real. And it makes you think, like, is this book critiquing religion? Like, what is the gospel of St. Liebowitz? It hasn't told us. Like, why is St. Liebowitz a saint when all he's done is store like mechanical documents? What is this, the religion of this book? Like, is it Catholicism? Francis goes to see the Pope. He gives him the documents, and he's like, sorry, the golden one got stolen. And the Pope is like, you know what? You didn't waste 12 years of your life. It was all worth it because they stole that one, but you have the original. And like, yeah, it sounds like religion, I guess. And then Francis heads back, and he dies. He gets murdered, and it was a waste. He did waste his life. So that's the end of book 1. Book 2 jumps 600 years further into the future. And the Abbey is still storing all these documents. They are now St. Liebowitz. You still have monks working there, storing the documents. But now they're kind of advancing. There's engineer monks. One of them is building a light bulb. And yeah, there's plot. Read the book if you want the plot. But what I find really interesting in this book is there's an interaction between the engineering monk and, well, it's an interaction between the boss of the engineering monk and one of the other monks who's like, should we be using these documents? I just don't think this is for us. Like, we just store the documents. We're stewards of these documents. We shouldn't be using these documents. We're just protecting them. We're keeping them safe. When that guy started talking, I realized, like, okay, this guy sounds more like a church guy. This guy is afraid of progress. This guy is like, we shouldn't be testing this. Like, this isn't for us to do. We just keep the documents. And again, I question the author's motivation. What is the religion of Liebowitz? What is the gospel of Liebowitz? What are they preaching? Is it saying science is a religion? It's confusing. It doesn't answer this question for me. And that leads me to the big critique of this book, by the way, which I really like and I still really recommend. The big critique of this book is that I don't think this is how science works. Like, we are now 1,200 years past the nuclear holocaust, right? Like, yes, 10 years after that, they should have been storing documents and all that stuff. 1,200 years pass. Documents, like a VCR manual from 1989 is not going to help you redo electricity and magnetism. This isn't how science works. I did a video about science jokes, and one of the comments was a funnier joke than any of the jokes in my video. And it said, 4 hours in the lab will save you 1 hour in the library. Because where we are right now in the world, if you're doing science in a lab, it makes sense to slow down and think, okay, has anybody done this before? I need to check the literature. It would be much faster for me to learn from previous people's mistakes than make all my own mistakes again. And so it's better to check the library before you start your experiment. But the people of this book do not live in our world. They live in a world where they have to travel by donkey through gangs of bad guys to get to documents. And that it doesn't make sense to make that journey. Like, hospitals don't exist. Diphtheria does still exist. Why would you risk infection to to ride a donkey 600 miles, to look at a random memo from a Bell Labs company that doesn't make any sense to you because it doesn't have any basic science in it, because it's not a textbook. It doesn't make sense. 1,200 years have passed. Someone else would have just redone the experiments. Because the thing about science is that it is not invented. Science is discovered. In 1,200 years, people just, lightning still exists. Metal still exists. You would just rediscover electricity. It doesn't make sense that everyone just stopped doing all science and the way ahead is to just go to random monasteries and look at documents. I think it's a really interesting, of its time, way of thinking about science, because this was written in 1957. Of course, in very recent memory of this book being written, the bombs had dropped. There were more and more bombs being built. Like, the nuclear arms race was getting really, really serious. And this was an actual thing people were thinking about. Let me read you a quote from Richard Feynman, who's a famous physicist. If in some cataclysm, World of Warcraft cataclysm, all scientific knowledge were to be destroyed and only one sentence passed on to the next generation of creatures, what statement would contain the most information in the fewest words? I believe it is the atomic hypothesis, or atomic fact, or whatever you wish to call it, that all things are made of atoms, little particles that move around in perpetual motion, attracting each other when they are a little distance apart, but repelling upon being squeezed into one another. In that one sentence, you will see an enormous amount of information about the world, if just a little imagination and thinking are applied. I don't know if this is the best sentence, but you can see that at this time, at the time when this book was written, physicists, world governments were thinking, okay, if everything's over, what is the future like? Like, if all knowledge is destroyed, how will we make sure that science lives on? And Richard Feynman is thinking in telling stories. Like, you repeat a legend and you talk about atoms, and that is how the atomic hypothesis will move forward. It's not in storing random documents in libraries that aren't like a textbook. Like, yeah, a textbook would be really helpful to keep in your little Catholic library, but a blueprint, an HVAC diagram for an engineering building on a university campus, that doesn't teach you about electricity. It doesn't teach you about airflow or like hydrodynamics. It just teaches you like what the regulations were for building buildings at a specific time. So Richard Feynman is on to something here, because he's suggesting that you tell science through stories, through legends, through oral histories that would be transferred from generation to generation, even if nothing is written down, even if the child who learns the little rhyme about squishing atoms together doesn't understand what it means. Eventually people would be able to pick it apart. How do you make a symbol that can teach future humans who don't know anything about radiation or nuclear weapons or nuclear waste that, going to a nuclear waste storage facility and digging up the ground and planting potatoes and then eating those potatoes would be really, really bad. There's stuff like the government-funded project to talk about radioactive cat, a way to maybe edit the genome of a living creature so that when it approached radiation, it would start glowing or something. So humans could be like, I don't know why the cat glows, but glowing is bad. Glowing means you die, I find this book so interesting because it's so of the time. Like, it's placed perfectly in this time when everyone is like, obviously nuclear winter destroys absolutely everything. How can we plan for a future beyond that, even though we're all obviously going to die and everything is horrible? And people don't really think this way anymore. And I don't think we should forget this mindset. We should be scared. But at the end of book 2, they make a light bulb. There's a 600-year time jump again, and they're like, okay, we're in the space age again. We're in the nuclear age again. And nuclear war is going to happen again. This book talks about the cyclical nature of history, and there's this implication that science will also have a cyclical nature. Like, humans will always build up science and then destroy themselves with it. That is what will always happen. Time is a circle. And the Church of Liebowitz is like, we have to protect the gospel. And again, what is the Church of Liebowitz? What is the gospel of Liebowitz? What is the message they want to send with their church? I have never wanted to talk to an author more and be like, what do you mean? Anyway, to protect the gospel of Liebowitz, the church commissions a spacecraft, and they're going to send like colonists with a priest or a monk or whatever to go spread the gospel of Liebowitz on another planet. The monk doesn't want to go, it's a whole thing, but that's not important to the plot. So they go, whatever. On Earth, nuclear war happens, and the abbey, is it an abbey? I don't know Catholic words. The church is going to open its doors for the first time in like 2,000 years to make itself like a field hospital. And the doctor comes to talk to the priest, and the priest is like, but listen to me. You can treat people here, but I don't want you doing that one treatment. Like, yeah, people are going to come to you with a terrible, terrible radiation poisoning, and they're going to die from that in extreme pain and terror. But I don't want you to offer them this sweet relief of like a pill that would kill them. The doctor is like that's the most messed up thing I've ever heard in my life. But like, I guess because we need to treat these patients. Later, the doctor comes and he's like, yeah, I couldn't do it. And in this book right here, a woman and a literal baby are dying of radiation poisoning, and the baby is described as like mewing like a cat, because the thing about radiation poisoning is that it's just pain until you die, right? There's no cure. We know this. The author of this book knows this. There's no cure. It's increasing pain until you die. It's the worst death imaginable. And the baby has it. And the doctor is like, no, we have to offer a treatment to this baby. This baby is suffering. It doesn't know why it's suffering. It is insane to let this go on. And the priest is like insanely angry at this. He grabs the woman and he's like, how dare you? How dare you do this? How can you do this? And he convinces her not to do it. And then it describes in detail her sad, crying, dying child. And so she finally takes it to another hospital, and they're going to do the thing. And the priest chases after them and tries to stop her and like tries to rip the incredibly in pain baby out of her arms. And I've never hated a character more. I've never hated a person in a book more. And I was so angry reading it, because it's just, I don't understand why. So this church is the traditional Catholic Church, I guess. And so they're saying like, no, you have to suffer and die. This is your fault. But even in the future, even in this specific instance with a literal baby, is this the plot of this book? He goes back, the head priest or whatever, and then there's another bomb, and like the Church of Liebowitz falls and crashes literally on top of him. A proxy for the Virgin Mary comes and gives him, I don't know the church words, the Eurochrist, like the body of Christ, and like forgives him for his sins, and he feels better about that. And again, I want to ask the author, what exactly does this guy feel bad about? Does he feel bad that he let that woman, treat her baby? Or does he feel bad that he didn't rip the baby out and make that baby suffer and die a horrible death? Like, why does he feel better? What does he feel better about? What is the point of this book? Walter Miller Jr., the author of this book, he was in World War II. He participated in the bombing of a Catholic church. He feels very bad about that. He goes home. He converts to Catholicism. He writes a bunch of short stories. He writes this book. Everybody loves this book. He lives in seclusion. He doesn't write anything else again. He doesn't do interviews. And then he writes a sequel. He turns in the unedited manuscript to his publisher, and then he kills himself. So, what does he mean? At the time of this writing, he was a Catholic. So is the church good? Was the church responsible for the second nuclear war because they protected the documents? Is it inevitable? Does God want nuclear winter? Does he want us to live in a cycle of, making bombs and killing ourselves, and then making light bulbs and then making bombs? What? I've never wanted to talk to an author more. I usually think you read the book and you interpret it how you want, but he doesn't say anything in the book. It makes you think about it. This book makes you think, how dare you? How dare you write a book and make me think about it, make me come to my own conclusions about my opinion, I'm making a joke. You get that, right? You get that I'm joking. Like, that's what makes this book good. It makes you ask questions and think about things. Like, I hated this book. I slammed it shut, but I've been thinking about it nonstop for 3 weeks. And that means it's a good book. So, read this book.